Good afternoon. You're watching In Conversation. I am Godfrey Mutizwa. Now, in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, it is easy to forget that 2020 is the last year of the decade of African women, a period in which the African Union sought to advance women's economic and financial inclusion. Now, in his acceptance speech at the African Union, where he was taking over the chairmanship, President Cyril Ramaphosa recommitted to make sure that women's issues are, in his words, mainstreamed, and the years 2020 to 2030 declared as the decade of African women's financial and economic inclusion. So this is a good time as any, I think, to look back and ask the question, how well have we done in that previous decade? And in the light of COVID-19, what do we need to change and mainstream the empowerment of women? For this conversation, I am joined by Leila Ebrahimi, Director in PwC's People's and Organization Division, to talk about these issues. Leila, good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon, Godfrey. Thank you for having me.
So if you were to measure the work that has been done by the African Union in the past decade, and also I want to go back to a period when many people, I think when you talk about women's issue, will easily relate the Beijing time. Have we made the kind of progress that you'd imagine should have been made by now, given the effort and the rhetoric that we have seen around women's empowerment?
I would love to answer that question with a yes. I do think we've made progress and we've made substantial progress. Unfortunately, I don't feel that way. I think that the stats speak for themselves, and we obviously released our 12th edition of our Executive Directors' Practices and Trends report lately. And the stats are still shocking, unfortunately, with 6% of CEOs being female. We've got 15% female representation in executive directors. So that alone, I think, speaks to the problem. And that's only talking about representation and participation, amongst executives, not even going further than that or starting to talk about the gender pay gap. I think many of your viewers will be aware of the WEF, the World Economic Forum, and the research that they do. They've released the number 257. It pains me to say it. They say at the current rates of progress, it'll take 257 years to close the economic gender gap. And I think as women, we shouldn't be accepting that. We shouldn't even be repeating that number. I only say it for the shock factor because it truly is shocking. And even interestingly, the Gender Gap Index 2020 found that even the countries that are doing the best at this still haven't managed to close the gap completely. So I think it's not that we are necessarily doing worse than other countries or that Africa is doing worse than other continents. I just think that internationally, we haven't really gotten anywhere with solving this problem yet.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, Leila, that it's women's work, yes, but also those partners that believe in women's work, because all of us come from homes where you have men and women who are talking about the advancement of their children, and they don't say, I am talking about the advancement of my son versus the advancement of my daughter. I wanted to look still from a broader perspective, talk a little bit about the impediments that you have seen when you do this kind of studies that are preventing women from advancing. Are we talking structural here? Are we talking institutional here? Or are we talking just bad people who are in good positions of power?
So I think the first thing we need to acknowledge is that it is complex and it is complicated. And I want to put that out there because often what happens is we start, as organizations, we start looking into the problem and then we see, oh, this is really complex and I'm actually not equipped to solve this. And then we rapidly take a step back and say, well, I can't do anything. It's just too complex. And that's why I've really been trying to speak lately about do something, take action. Action is better than inaction in this case, and take a step in the right direction. Because, there's been a lot of really good research. I'll mention Professor Anita Bosch because she's done amazing work into understanding what are the factors that are actually contributing to the gap. And she talks about, it starts as young as when we're girls and we're being socialized in a particular way that this is what women should be like. They should be non-aggressive, or they should be caring, or they should be humble. They shouldn't be asking for what they want. It starts as young as there, but then it's also men and how, boys, how are they being socialized? How do they become men? But there are also problems in the workplace, and I like to talk about these ones because I think that's where actually the action lies for us. And I think when we look at our workplaces as leaders, whether we're male or whether we're female, you mentioned earlier that it's not a woman's problem and women can't solve it. It's unavoidable that we conclude that Men are in these positions of power. So in order for change to happen, we really need men on board as well. And then I think it's important to realize that it's not about kicking out men. And as long as we talk about it in that way, men are going to perceive this as a threat, and that's not what it is. It's about growing the pie for everybody. It's about creating more opportunity for all of us so that women can take their rightful place. And I think that's an important point to mention. What I also was mentioning there when I got cut off is we need to really, as leaders, look at our workplaces and see what kind of culture do we have in our workplaces, and whether that's a culture which expects behavior of, you're familiar with the term, I'm sure, the ideal worker, somebody who has no commitments outside of their work and they're 24/7 available. They have no caring obligations and all of those kinds of things. This change has to start at the top. So leaders really need to ask themselves the question, am I perpetuating that stereotype, which women fail to meet, but also a lot of men don't want to meet these days?
Absolutely. And I agree with you on that front. So you say we need to begin at the top. And at the top, I opened our discussion by referring to the African Decade for Women, and also the commitment of President Cyril Ramaphosa as he took over the chairmanship of the AU to focus on women's issues. So he spoke. Let's talk about the practical things that you think at his level he should be making. Number one, from the African perspective. And then secondly, let's also talk national.
Yeah. So I think the most obvious thing, and certainly the thing that has been most called for in terms of action, politically induced action, is really the mandatory disclosure of representation and of the gender pay gap. So there's been a lot of discussion around this, and you'll be aware, and your viewers will be aware, that there are proposed amendments to the Companies Act, which are currently in play, that make mandatory disclosure of the income pay gap. Bringing about mandatory disclosure of that, but that's the highest paid and the lowest paid worker. What we haven't seen yet is anything to do with the gender pay gap. And there are a lot of people who believe that something as simple as that, so changing, for example, our Companies Act, and bringing about that mandatory disclosure within the remuneration reports, really will stimulate change. Because obviously it becomes a strategic priority, because it is something that gets reported on and we have the public pressures. Yeah. And I think that's something that, is not just a South African prerogative, but really an African prerogative, because we don't have any countries within our continent that actually have legislation like that. You'll be aware that the UK has legislation like that, but certainly within our continent, we haven't moved in that direction yet.
I wanted to widen that discussion around putting in a law and just encompass it in terms of, in general, in terms of how we can use the law to advance the role of women. Do we need to put it in law, for instance, on issues like procurement, that this becomes a legal requirement for a corporation when it goes out there and it asks for tenders and bidders to come in on certain contracts to ensure that there is women's representation? Do you think that's the way to go? Because asking people and saying, hello guys, we know you are good people, you can do this out of the goodness of your heart, it hasn't worked.
It hasn't worked, and I think that's becoming more stark. And personally, I'm never in favor of laws, because in the work that I do, I have seen that it's very difficult for a legislator who's coming in, not from industry, but is coming in as a legal mind, to get it right and really encompass the issue correctly in legislation. And that's not a South African problem, that's an international problem. We've seen it internationally. So I'm always hesitant to say that I do think we need to actually start legislating these things. But I think it's crystal clear that we're not going to fix this through relying on, essentially the kindness of strangers, if you want to put it like that. Yeah. It really is something that needs to be elevated. And I think there's a lot of research that's been coming out lately, which shows that businesses are not making gender equality a strategic priority. So if you read through their integrated reports, it doesn't say anything about it. And accordingly, there's no action being taken. And certainly, in my interactions in the work that I do, I quoted earlier an example where I was on a global conference, a PwC conference with, clients from all over the world, and there were breakaway rooms. And they said, what strategic priorities are you currently talking about, and what would you like to discuss? And you could choose which room to enter. In the gender pay gap room, there was no one, or actually was just the gender as a strategic priority and gender equality. Nobody joined that room out of everybody that was in the conference. And I think that speaks exactly to your question. We're not going to get there by just relying on people's good nature. We actually have to start mandating it.
Yeah, and I wanted to add another example to that. So just the other day, and I am not panning Nedbank here. I just want to make the point about a story I saw just the other day. The chief financial officer of Nedbank had been in her position for 11 years, 11 years as chief financial officer. And you can talk about the proverbial glass ceiling here without question. And so the route where you are saying to people, let's do this because it's the correct thing to do, perhaps as we said, it's not quite working. So in terms of advancing women, should we also look at the law?
Yes, and I think that there are some, I hate to use the term, but there are some easy wins here. So,
Right,
things
let's
like
talk about them.
how do absolutely. So things like let's start at advertising a role. When you advertise a role, what is the language you're using in a job advert? So there's a lot of research, and behavioral, experts have looked into this and seen actually how language in a job advertisement is gendered. And it was shocking to me when I heard that. Things like setting pay scales, things like looking at job evaluations, which attributes a worth to a job. So I would recommend that people who, within an organization who are actually wanting to make these changes need to start saying, okay, what are we doing about shortlisting candidates? What are we doing about the language that we're using in our adverts where we actually advertise a role? For example, are we using the term the pay is negotiable, or are we not? Because we know women are less inclined to negotiate the pay. A simple statement like that within the job advert can encourage women to actually negotiate their pay, because we know that that's some of the problem. It's definitely not the majority of the problem, but it's some of it. We've heard talk about things like blind CVs, but also actively putting into place investment programs within organizations to say, how do we identify women? How do we mentor them? How do we skills train them? How do we invest in them? And how do we make sure that if we have a succession role, so if we've identified successors to these important, just talking about executives now,
Yeah.
making sure that enough of those are female, and we are actively taking those females, we are exposing them to things that we maybe don't think they're ready for, but
Yeah.
we're accelerating transformation through these active interventions.
We ought to be doing that. So COVID-19 came, and COVID-19 changed the landscape as we know it, making sure that, as some people say, we had an acceleration in some of our priorities versus others taking a back step. And the danger, of course, is that we may well, in trying to address COVID-19, forget about the other priorities, including the empowerment of women. I want your thoughts in terms of how we can prevent this, and also suggestions on how perhaps we can take advantage of the crisis that's been brought by COVID-19 to ensure we actually perhaps advance faster than we may well have done if COVID-19 hadn't come.
Yeah. So it's an interesting one, because I've really seen both sides of the spectrum here. And our report talks a lot about this. It talks about how, we've said COVID-19 is actually almost a catalyst for change, because it's saying, and we're obviously specifically talking about remuneration and strategic initiatives linked there too. And we're saying that suddenly we're looking and saying, what we did historically isn't working anymore. So we cannot keep doing the same thing that we've always done. For instance, we cannot achieve those aggressive growth targets that we have been fighting for all this time. So we actually use it as an opportunity to take a step back and have a look and say, what can we do differently? And as we look around the world and internationally, we see, the trends that we monitor in these kinds of areas. What we're really seeing is sustainability and ESG, environmental social governance concerns are really coming to the forefront.
Yeah.
What we have been predicting as PwC for a number of years, in terms of how the workplace is going to move, is that we've been predicting that 3, 4, 5 years down the line, we're going to see workplaces change completely, more roles become automated, more agile teams, more flexible structures, things like that. Now we've seen with COVID, as you quite rightly say, these trends are accelerated. So suddenly all those things that we thought were only going to happen in 5 years are now here. Now a lot of the roles that were traditionally, for example, very well paid, are starting to become automated. And what are we seeing? I mean, we've seen it now with nurses, with teachers, with childcare, that the roles that women filled, and it's not just those roles, but roles that women filled, those creative roles and those caring roles, suddenly we're seeing the value of those roles. And we can see now that they have been undervalued.
Right.
So it's both, as you say, it's structural. I mean, there's a lot of change that we see coming. COVID is definitely making people step back and ask questions about strategy and design.
Yeah, yeah. And so the change that needs then to be focused on, does that happen at the company level, or are we talking here about government action that specifically targets trying to make sure, number one, that we are not forgetting about what we need to do on the women's front, and number two, that we're actually accelerating what we wanted to do yesterday?
Yeah. So I think this is one of those areas where, yes, there is a role for government. And I think we've talked about legislation and so on, which is
Yeah,
the primary role other than awareness. But really, this is something that organizations can't get away from. We cannot say this is their problem. This is our problem. And I think, businesses are in a position to actually make real change here. So I think, in terms of who bears the responsibility for this change, I think it's boards of directors, I think it's executives, it's leadership. As I mentioned earlier, I truly believe change has to come from the top and the tone needs to be set from the top. We also can't forget about shareholders. There's definitely a role to be played here for shareholders. And we've seen within South Africa a lot of activism in the last couple of years about ESG matters. It has largely been focused on climate change and the kind of E, or the environmental aspect of the ESG. But I definitely predict, and the Companies Act amendments, or the proposed amendments, are an example of this, that the
yeah,
social aspect of it is going
yeah,
to start coming to the forefront. And we're
yeah.
going to start seeing pressure from shareholders relating to these kinds of issues.
Yeah, I wanted actually to focus on ESG and the role that it can play. Should shareholders be more active in demanding that, hello, your exco is looking the wrong way in terms of representativity?
Yes, there are definitely a lot of people who are saying that shareholders do need to do that. And of course, there are bodies like the UNPRI, Principles for Responsible Investing. There's
Yes.
CRISA, which is a similar body, who are saying that shareholders have a responsibility to actually bring these elements into their voting policies. And we've definitely seen it in an international context. Within the South African context, there's definitely increasing discussion amongst institutional investors and so on about these ESG issues and
Yeah.
how they come in. And I've personally seen a lot of organizations now starting to think about ESG, really develop an ESG strategy. And something important here is, how can you say that you prioritize something if
Yeah.
there's no sanction or no reward associated
Right.
with it? So what we're
Right.
seeing, I mean, obviously I co-lead the reward practice. So what I'm personally seeing is there's now this drive, which we've again been predicting for a number of years, but it's here,
Yeah.
to actually bring in an ESG metric into pay. So saying, of your bonus or of your long-term incentive,
Yeah.
a portion of it is going to be linked to qualitative, can be quantitative,
Yeah.
measures linking to these ESG priorities that you've identified.
Yeah, yeah. But Leila, someone needs to be driving this. Who do we task to drive this, to make sure that we're able to use ESG as an instrument to advance women? Because I was going to ask you the question, who is these shareholders that we are talking about? If we break them down, we're actually going to see perhaps that these are largely men. And I'm one of them, by the way. I'm not just making the accusation here. I am making the point that we need someone who scrutinizes and then drives this issue to make sure that it's not forgotten, because people go back to their jobs and they forget about some of these things unless someone is prodding and saying, hello, you committed and you need to do this. And as you said yourself, perhaps put in an incentive or at least some kind of sanction if you don't meet the requirement.
Absolutely. And I think that question that you've just asked is the most important question, but it's also the one that is impossible to answer, because at the end of the day, I think, shareholders find themselves in a very difficult position because they are looking for profits and returns. And anything like ESG doesn't necessarily, I mean, there are differing views. There are very strong views which say that, focusing on those issues will result in long-term sustainable value being created. There are also people who believe the opposite. But the point of the matter is shareholder primacy versus stakeholder inclusive approach don't
Yeah.
necessarily marry. So it is difficult to put that burden on the shoulders of shareholders who, as you quite rightly say, a lot of them are men. But from personal experience, I can say that there are a lot of passionate institutional investors out there who are including these kinds of things in their policies and really are driving this change. There are bodies like the UNPRI who really are driving this change. But all of this needs to fit into an ecosystem which is supportive and really mandates this kind of change happening,
Yeah.
which links back to my earlier comment. Without some sort of government intervention in the form of legislation,
Yeah.
I think that all of this is going to continue to be slow, and that 250 years, unfortunately, is going to be the reality.
Yeah, in 250 years, you and I won't be around. I want to throw a bone at you, Leila, and I want to talk about what we need to do to ensure that we are able to advance women's causes, especially during COVID. If you spoke to a company executive now, I'm sure they would answer you and say, you know what, the focus right now is that we need to survive this thing. Now, if you are going to put more responsibilities and other requirements on me, you are impeding my ability to be able to pull this company out of this porous. What would you say to people who argue like that when it's been clearly demonstrated that diversity in the workplace brings richer rewards than just focusing on what has been traditional to date?
So I think what I would say in answer to that is yes, it is important. We need to look after organizations. We need to ensure business survives. We need to preserve jobs. All of that is very important. But what I mentioned earlier is that, we've had aggressive growth targets for so long being demanded by shareholders. Now there's actually a break. There's a pause. And shareholders are saying, "Ooh, we understand that you can't achieve those aggressive growth targets that we have been demanding of you for so long." Because let's be honest, when you've got your mind on a really super stretching target, you haven't really got time to think about anything else which might get in the way of that. But now there's a different dialogue happening. There's how do we shift? How do we put something in place which speaks to maintenance and stabilization rather than aggressive growth? Now take advantage of that pause. Have the conversation with your shareholders and say, you know what, we need to rebase here. And we actually need to think about what does growth mean for us and what does sustainable long-term growth mean. And as part of that, we cannot deny that ESG has to be a topmost priority. So let us relook at our structures, let us relook at our strategy and reassess the role that ESG, and of course, when I say ESG, and particularly in terms of this conversation, I'm talking about the S aspect of that, the social aspect, and things like the gender pay gap, etc. And the boards need to have that conversation with shareholders and say, let's stop, let's just pause, let's press pause, and let's talk about this. ESG is important. We keep saying it is. Now is the opportunity to actually relook at our structures and see what kind of behavior are they driving. Are we just chasing profits year after year, that kind of short-termism that we always talk about? Or are we actually building something which in 10 years, 15 years time is going to really deliver value? And there's compelling arguments, as you quite rightly allude to, that have been made in that regard.
Yeah, so we have been focusing a lot of the conversation on what can be done at the national level. I wanted to take it continental and ask if there's a role you think for organizations like the African Union, for Pan-African women's organizations and my like-minded individuals to be part of the agenda and to be part of the drive to push up this representativity that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm a firm believer that the more conversation you have, the more awareness you drive about this, the more change we will have. And the only way that can happen and the way that it starts is by engaging and having conversations. So absolutely, I think the ideal and the starting point is get the topic on the agenda. So the same thing I'm saying at business level applies on a continental level. Every single opportunity we have, we need to get this on the agenda, because what I've realized in Women's Month actually, and having all of these conversations, is that the gender pay gap and the gender representation or participation problem often gets pushed down the priority list. And PwC does this, CEO pulse survey. And what we're seeing is there's always something, and it's the point you make about COVID, there's always something more pressing. There's always something more urgent. There's always something that demands attention, so that this gets pushed down to, number 4, number 5 in the priority. And the reality is we never get to number 4, number 5 in the priority list. And the same thing holds true on a continental level. We're not talking about this because Africa as a continent has other problems which are more urgent or more pressing that we keep talking about and we keep seeking to address. So really what I'm saying is prioritize it, bring it into the conversation as much as possible, and also acknowledge that there are simple, easy wins that we can put in place, such as the ones you and I have been talking about today, which really can make a tangible difference here.
Yeah, so I was going to say in wrapping, I wanted you to prioritize actually those little things that we can do that will make a substantial difference to our women's work on the ground.
Yeah. So I think the first and the easiest win is really looking at your HR practices. So in summary, a couple of these things I've mentioned already. So looking at your recruitment practices, looking at your promotion practices, putting in place targets, not quotas, but targets. So this is what we are aiming towards. Increasing your transparency. So within your integrated report, within your remuneration report, talking about it is a good first step, because then you can be held accountable. Looking at your bonuses, for example, are they discretionary? If they're not, are they formulaic? What is the formula based on? Can we ensure, or can we try to make sure that no bias is creeping into the system? So that's all the stuff you can do in the that's not all, that's some of the stuff you can do within the HR kind of paradigm. Then looking at leadership. Leadership has to make sure this is a strategic priority. There's got to be one woman on your board somewhere. That woman needs to find her voice, and she needs to speak up. And it's not great, because often you become known as that woman who's talking about that issue, but she is the one unfortunately,
Yeah.
she is the one that has got to make her voice heard. She's got to be a trailblazer for the other women. She's got to get the topic on the agenda. And men have also got to find their place as equal and willing partners in this conversation. And I really challenge the men out there to say, you know what? I have a wife, I have a daughter, I love women, and I really want to make sure that this issue, it doesn't take 257 years. So
Yeah.
I'm going to bring this topic onto the agenda. As a man, don't just leave it to the woman to raise the issue. Be
Yeah.
that man.
Well, I
And
am
that's
that
and that's
man.
just things within organizations.
I
Yeah,
am that man.
absolutely.
My hand is up, and I will say I want the best for my daughters as much as I want the best for my sons. Leila Ebrahimi, thanks very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Leila
It's
is
been an absolute
director.
pleasure.
Thank you. Leila is director at PwC's People's Organization Division, joining us for our conversation on the work that needs to be done to ensure that we are able to count women as participants, and not as a special case, but as just normal people who are taking part in the economies in which they are already making a difference without official assistance. Until next time in our conversation, goodbye for today.
I don't think